This morning, South Africans are waiting in anticipation for any developments from this weekend's ANC Top 6 leadership meeting with President Jacob Zuma on his future as the head of state. The country's political uncertainty has also raised concerns globally, including the United States. For more, let's cross to our US correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, on Skype in New York. Sherwin, I say good morning, but good evening to you.
Good morning, Leanne.
Sherwin, let's talk about some reaction and the sentiments of those living out of South Africa, because we know how we're feeling. But let's just get an idea, after this weekend, all of these leadership tussles that are happening within the ANC and within the leadership and the heart of South Africa, what kind of questions are you getting? How are people feeling from an international perspective regarding South Africa?
Well, I think context is always important in these situations. I think as a South African sitting in South Africa, this is big news. You feel it in your bones every day. You're waiting for the conclusion of these transition negotiations between the leadership of the ANC. But of course, it's quite different in the United States because we are living in the era of President Donald Trump. And South Africans must recognize that, the United States government has just gone through a second government shutdown. In the space of 3 weeks, we saw a record daily losses on the New York Stock Exchange, twice over 1,000 points in the past week. 2 senior White House staff officials on Friday resigned over sexual assault allegations. There's a lot going on in the United States. So the Zuma transition is perhaps not the biggest headline news in the United States, and that context, I think, is important. We are, as South African expats, as a South African journalist, stopped from time to time with people sort of with bemused expressions on their faces, saying, what is going on in South Africa? When is President Zuma going to go? And of course, it's not an answer that one readily has available given what has transpired in South Africa, but certainly there is interest. We've seen a number of the big publications here, particularly the East Coast publications, papers like the Washington Post, the New York Times, if you go more international, the Economist, the Financial Times, and the sentiment towards President Zuma and certainly his imminent departure has not been very positive. So that's kind of the context that South Africans need to understand. Jacob Zuma is not on television news in the United States every day, certainly not as much as he is in South Africa today, Leanne.
Yeah, and I can understand that, because it is, it's a big issue for us, but I think America has their own issues to deal with, as you've put it so well. But in terms of the political uncertainty within South Africa, and I mean, you work very closely in the UN. Is there talk amongst the ranks of the UN looking in and hoping that obviously there will be this peaceful transition that we're hoping for?
Well, I think from an economic point of view, Leanne, that's when the question of political uncertainty comes in. When you go to the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, when you see Malusi Gigaba, the new finance minister, having traveled to the United States 3 times since his appointment last March, I mean, that's pretty amazing. So there's clearly a recognition from South Africa's point of view at the important role, certainly from an economic point of view, that the United States represents. At the United Nations, it's a different story. I did an interview with Ban Ki-moon a couple of years ago, and he described President Jacob Zuma as a visionary leader. President Zuma has very much invested the South African government under his tenure, but also as his predecessors had done, in terms and invested them in terms of the multilateral process. He's played a functionary role on a number of high-level panels, an education panel appointed by Ban Ki-moon, a water panel made up of heads of state. He was also the co-chair of the UN Sustainability Forum, the chair of the Open Government Partnership. South Africa played a critical role in the climate change negotiations, leading the G77 plus China during that period. Very, very much invested in the multilateral process. South Africa is also seeking a permanent seat on the Security Council, although they don't talk too much about that yet because Africa still needs to decide. So certainly from a UN perspective, South Africa is a very important member of the United Nations. They have peacekeepers in the Democratic Republic of Congo, very much engaged in the multilateral process. So I think, a tale of two cities, if you will.
Yeah, it certainly is a tale of two cities. But, obviously this week we're hoping for a little bit of more insight into what is going on. And, you bring up the whole financial side of things, because I think that is what investors are worried about. And when we talk about the foreign foreigners looking into South Africa, I think it is more the economic side than anything else. I think South Africa establishing itself as a very peaceful nation, and yet it's that politics we worry about in terms of economy.
I would take it a little further than just the economy, Leah, and I think there's certainly a perception in the United States that all is not lost in South Africa, despite how many South Africans might feel this morning. I interviewed a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations last year, Ambassador John Campbell, who wrote a book last year about South Africa titled Morning in South Africa. And the thrust of this book is that, the sun is still rising in South Africa. This is a young democracy that is still proving itself on the world stage, but there are fundamental pillars of that democracy that are very much in place, and that is a free press, a standout independent judiciary, and a very vibrant civil society. And I think once you see those three pillars being undermined in a substantial way, then I think the people sitting on this side of the Atlantic get very, very concerned. But they say, look, lots of countries, the United States today is going through a great deal of internal turmoil. You can look at Venezuela, you can look at Argentina, you can look at Brazil, the list goes on. Angela Merkel is struggling to get her fourth term off the road in Germany. So clearly countries are going through something. It's when those pillars of democracy that are undermined that the warning bells certainly go off in these parts of the world.
All right, we'll leave it there. Sherwin, thanks very, very much for talking to us here on the program. So giving you a bit of I suppose, an upbeat perspective on, we base ourselves very much so on what's happening here, but the rest of the world not too concerned at this point. So I suppose we could read the great news into that one. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, our US correspondent, talking to us about those issues. But stay tuned in about, I suppose,